so thrilled to get to talk about The Day of the Jackal. I'm so happy you all got to see part 1 of the finale. Yup. Part 2 airing Thursday night. It's incredible. And welcome to producer, star, I'm a little scared of him, I'm going to back away, Eddie Redmayne. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on another Golden Globe nomination for this week for yourself, for the show, Critics' Choice. When you sign on for something, how much are you like, okay, I think this is going to connect, or is it, I mean, obviously you're not thinking about awards, but do you have a gut feeling when you're doing something?
God, the older I get, firstly, hi guys, thank you so much for coming. The truth is, I have no plan for anything in my life. It's all instinct. And with television, it was something I hadn't done for a while. And what happened was I was sent 3 scripts, the first 3 episodes. And I just found it so compelling. It was completely page-turning. And all I knew was that I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And that is the kind of television that I love. It seemed to cross genres. It was, on the one hand, it was this action piece, but it was also, I found it romantic. I found it dark. I found the morality gray and complex. And I just hoped that the rest of the episodes would live up to those first 3, and it was a thrilling ride.
Yeah, and they did. What was your connection to the? I mean, obviously it's a new take on The Day of the Jackal, but to the book or the film? You grew up watching the film, didn't you?
I did. It was my dad's favorite movie, the original movie, and when in the sort of 80s. In London, and then into the 90s, we had VHSs, and there were like 3 VHSs. There was The Day of the Jackal, Pretty Woman, and Dirty Dancing. And those were the three films that the Redmaynes watched on rotation.
Have you done the lift ever?
I mean, in a swimming pool. I've tried and failed. So I used to watch them at a really inappropriately young age. And there was something about the Jackal. It was also, my dad loved the early Bond movies and those kind of analog 70s thrillers in which it was about that wonderful chess playing, that kind of pre-planning of a situation, and then the catharsis as it all kind of rolled out. And I used to love that. And there was something about Edward Fox that was so... He was just so enigmatic and so stylish and so effortless. I don't know, I was like really compelled by it as a kid. And so when these scripts arrived, I was like, I'm not even going to open that email because that is sacrilege, touching such a brilliant piece. But when I got over that and started reading them, because it was set now, it felt like something other. It retained those elements that I'd love, this kind of analog thing, the core DNA, the peacocking quality of the Jackal, but it felt like something of the now. And so, other than my dad telling me not to fuck it up, it felt very liberating.
And I imagine there was a draw of being able to, I mean, this is your first starring role in a series, and it is probably a different experience shooting a film versus doing 10 episodes playing this character, or is it the depth to which you get to know your character?
Yeah, I mean, it's a completely different challenge, and one of the challenges is you start not knowing where you're ending. You know, quite often with television these days, you don't have the whole arc of the thing. But also, I love watching television, and those actors that I get completely starstruck by are the ones that I make a date with every week to go and watch in my living room, and I kind of get completely pulled into their world. And so I was curious about doing that, having not done it for a while. And what was interesting to me is that in the film and in the character is so enigmatic but so opaque, you really don't get a sense of him. And when I saw what this series had done in opening him out and trying to align these two almost completely different humans and finding where they melded, that was the challenge ultimately.
And tell me about, I mean, you're a producer on this, as is Lashana Lynch, who's incredible in the series. What was it like when the two of you came together? You don't come together too much on screen, but I know you collaborated so much behind the scenes.
It was so strange because even though I knew that structurally that was what the show was going to be, you still kind of assume that you're going to be hanging out together. But the thing about the making of this was that we were shooting in London, in Hungary, and in Croatia, and you had different units working at the same time. So, Lashana would be in London while I was in an island off the Dalmatian coast, and we were. But
you
we
won.
met. Say again.
You won.
I won. I definitely won. Although actually, there was a moment where I'd been away from home for so long that Lashana was sending me photos of like Sainsbury's, which is like a sort of, supermarket in London. And I was sort of crying over this. I want to be in Sainsbury's. But it was. What am I saying? We were very aligned. I mean, Nina Gold, our casting director, cast us well in the sense that both of these characters have a meticulous, obsessive quality, and I adore Lashana, and she's wonderful both as a human being, as an actor, but also as a producer, because there is a forensic quality to the way that we work in. And we learned a lot, honestly. That I think when your face is on screen, you care a lot. So things like what happens with television is that you see thousands and thousands of edits and iterations of the same thing. And I think there can come a point when, as a team, you become numbed to the tiniest shifts. But if you're really welded to it and you've worked from those embryonic stages, you want to keep coming back. And it was actually while I was in New York doing Cabaret, and in the mornings I would go to this hotel and work on the edits and the VFX shots, and it was quite a sort of bipolar living at that moment.
I was just going to ask you, what was that like, existing in those two worlds?
Well, I remember it was intriguing. I would show like cuts of a trailer to Jamie, who was doing my wigs, and go, "What do you think about this?" And she's like, "I like the music." Or there'd be a VFX shot that we'd been working on for months, and because did it look real? Did it look real? But we'd made it look so much better. But did it look real? And then Gail Rankin, who was a wonderful co-star, would be like, "No, it doesn't. It looks like Harry Potter." So we'd be like, "Okay, that needs it," because you get blind to some of these things. So the Cabaret troupe were helpful in their notes.
I love that. Before we get into some of the specifics about this episode and kind of where we are in the series, you mentioned that you were on an island and Lashana was in London. I know you were filming along the Dalmatian coast. I mean, dream. Was this, were you like, and now that I'm a producer, we are going on vacation?
Seriously, I mean, I'm not going to lie, there was that element in the seduction of the job. Like, I'm the guy that I'm obsessed with White Lotus. Like, I love those shows that you sit on a, very much like tonight, on a rainy December evening, and you get on your sofa and you get transported to very beautiful parts of the world. And I've never got to, there are two things, I've never got to do that, and I've never got to wear contemporary clothes before. Like I've sort of worked my way from Elizabethan clothes to, to kind of the 19th century with Les Mis, and I eked my way in the 1920s with Fantastic Beasts, and then last year I did this film called The Good Nurse, which was like the 90s, and finally I've emerged. Thank you very much. So I got to wear some very beautiful clothes in very beautiful locations, and that side of it was definitely not hard work. Although I was wearing a lot of Factor 90 sun cream to try and keep the freckles at bay.
I love that. When you were talking earlier about playing this character and how in the film he's kind of opaque, and I was curious for you, before you signed on the dotted line to do this series, was there something you needed to know about him, about what makes this person tick, and what's going on the inside?
Well, there were interesting things that we had discussions about. You know, both of these characters are driven by their work, and they are addicted to it in some ways. And that compulsion and that obsession when work and life kind of meld was something that I was interested in. It's something that I feel in some ways, because I'm so lucky to do a job that I love, and it can become sort of all-consuming at moments. So I sort of related to that, and this idea that he's going to retire. You know, he's like, just one more job, and then I'm done. But do you believe it? I mean, it's sort of this idea of him sitting, albeit in that very beautiful house in Spain, just kind of living the dream. I feel like there's something in him that wouldn't allow that. But one of the great insights, I work with this wonderful woman called Alex Reynolds, who is a movement coach, a dancer who I first worked with on Theory of Everything, and we did a bit of work on some of the characters in this, and she found this amazing video of David Bowie being interviewed, and it was one of the first times that he was dressed kind of as him, so he wasn't in one of his personas. And the interviewer is really kind of needling at him. And he, in this interview, and it's worth looking up on YouTube, he's so still and so compelling. And the way that he listens is so intriguing. But also the way he talks about using these different guises, that he's much more comfortable in those. It was both the way he held himself, but also kind of how he discussed acting, I suppose, what was a real insight into who I felt that Jackal might be.
It's interesting you say that, because when watching the show, I'm so struck by how still your performance is. Did you find yourself just deciding that it feels like there's no extraneous movement, there's certainly no extraneous dialogue, because he doesn't talk all that much. Yeah. Was that something that when you were coming up with how this person walked through life that you thought about?
Yeah, on the front of my first script was, I wrote like a hot knife through butter, and this idea that the way he navigates himself through space is like deeply economic. He doesn't flap. I'm very flappable as a human being. I'm like the least chilled human, and he is. But there was something, again, you know, the craft of what he does and his obsession with process just felt like really intrinsic to who he was, and I wanted to work on that. So in that opening episode, the way he assembles the gun, I wanted it to be like a ballet, and I would rehearse with the prop in my hotel room, listening to Chopin, and kind of, because it would zen me out. And the one thing I've tried to take away from this character is to try and learn that, I can't remember, there's that expression, less haste, more haste, less whatever it is, but just about sort of not, you know, if you're in a crisis, take a moment, breathe through it. And that also stemmed from the way that these snipers take shots. So when you take a long-range shot, you have your finger and the tip of it sits on the trigger, and it just engages. And you take a breath, you breathe out, and you take a second one, kukung. Like that, it's at the end of the second breath that you just pull that trigger ever so slightly, and it's almost to make the least movement possible. And so the idea of being zen in the most extreme circumstances was kind of intriguing, but also with it is this odd thing that, you know, when we see in wars or images in newspapers, sort of explosions and the messiness of the savagery of things, there's something inhuman about it. You feel at a distance from it. And yet when snipers are doing this thing, you have the face of the person magnified in the lens, and you can't help but engage in their humanity. So I found like, what sort of person is capable of that? It was or of closing themselves off.
In this episode, when he is assembling, when he's on the boat and he's assembling it, it is so precise. And then even when he has to turn and there's someone on the wave runner or even the drone, it's even that just feels like he takes care of it and then he comes back and he doesn't get flustered, and it's still that same, like you said, that ballet-esque movement, and it's beautiful. Well, despite what it is.
That moment that you just saw in this, so that is, as I'm sure you guys know, like a Steadicam camera. So when we're filming scenes on film or television and you're walking, quite often they have like a steady, they're harnessed in and they kind of hold the guys who operate these cameras are the rock stars of film sets, because camera's incredibly heavy. They really are. And whenever you're shooting a film and the Steadicam operator comes in, like the sort of crowds part, and you hear about these famous scenes like in Atonement when, it was a one shot for like 11 minutes, and how did that guy hold that weight? And as actors, we were always very grateful for that, but I've never actually had to hold one until prepping for this, and my respect for those operators is now through the roof, because I did 2 days shooting that sequence on the boat, and by the end I had to check myself into like a spa for massages. I was like, I couldn't move myself. But it was, it's interesting, that sequence, because we had 2 days to shoot it. It was our brilliant director of the last block, a woman called Anu Menon, and because we were shooting in Croatia, but we were shooting all of the blocks, as it were, the whole series. We'd started early in the summer, but it was now kind of November, and it was meant to be sunny and beautiful, and the weather was horrendous. So the first day of shooting on the boat, it was kind of torrential rain and wind, and then we only had the following day, fortunately, it was flat. So don't look too closely at the difference between cloud cover and sunshine in that scene, but we had to just bang it out as quickly as we could. So there was a great sort of symbiosis that came between myself playing with the Steadicam and Laurie, who was our cinematographer, and also holding the camera there. It became a bit of a dance between the two of us.
Yeah, it's incredible. A lot of people are rightfully talking about the Jackal's various costumes, prosthetics, wigs, teeth, eyes, like every single thing. A wheelchair. It's one after another from the very first minutes of the series in episode 1. Did you have one of his personas that stood out to you the most, as even as a producer, as you were going back and watching dailies or assembling this series? You were like, oh, I love this one.
Well, the biggest challenge was probably that first one, because when I read the first episode, that I just thought it was such a coup in the writing, if we could let an audience believe, or kind of believe, that this guy was a 65-year-old chain-smoking janitor. That was a challenge for me, a German, and I don't speak a word of German. But that process was such an astonishing demonstration of teamwork. So I had the most brilliant prosthetics artist, Richard, a brilliant head of makeup department, Mel, Alex, my movement coach, a brilliant cinematographer, Chris Ross, Brian Kirk, our director, Natalie, our costume designer, and all of those departments, any single shift you do in one has to be mirrored in the rest. So it really is teamwork, and kind of as the actor, you're in the middle of it trying to... So, for example, I'd learnt the German phonetically, and it was kind of sagt einem was an diesem verdammten Ort, all these sort of lines, whatever it was, no idea what it means. And then that was fine until the prosthetic was on, and it sounded like a kind of a kid's voice with this chain smoke, and so suddenly you then, you sort of like, and which sounded ridiculous until you had the prosthetic on, and then it kind of worked. And similarly, if you were shifting the way you move physically, how that mirrored itself in the clothing and what angle that was best to capture. And that's always been interesting, is over the years, whether it was playing Stephen Hawking or Lily Elba in The Danish Girl, I love that side of things, when all of these departments, all of these like phenomenally skilled people are working at their best, but in collaboration with each other. And so I think that first moment was the most challenging, because we felt like if we could get an audience to engage in those first 30 minutes in which not much is said and stuff that is said is all in German, like if they were engaged, then hopefully we had a chance of luring people into our web of deceit.
What does that look like the morning of? Is that like 4 hours in a chair?
I mean, I like to exaggerate. So I've been telling people it was like 4 or 5 hours, and I saw that Richard, our makeup artist, was like, no, it wasn't, mate, it was 3, like max. But it's such a... The other interesting thing about prosthetic performances is people think that you have lots of time to prep in it, but that they cost so much money, prosthetics, and they take so long to apply, that you really don't have much opportunity. So like the really great prosthetics performances, if I look at what Colin Farrell's doing in The Penguin, or what Gary Oldman did in The Darkest Hour, people go, oh, it's great prosthetic, but actually you don't get much time to inhabit them before you're shooting it on film. So I have a huge amount of respect for really great ones. But no, it's sitting in a chair, it's trying to be patient, it's listening to a podcast, it's then your earbuds getting stuck on the glue, having to remove them, sort of sipping things through straws because you can't, or having things stuffed up your nose so that you can breathe. It's pretty inelegant. And I always sort of would step out of the makeup trailer at 8 o'clock in the morning, having been there for 4 hours, feeling like I'd accomplished a huge amount, despite the fact that I hadn't shot anything yet. I was like, I'm ready to go home now. It's like, oh no, mate, you've got to go and actually do something.
I wanted to ask you about the specific episode that everyone just saw. We ended episode 8 having found out a lot about him and about the war and when he left and everything. Was that... and then we go into this episode with that knowledge. How was it for you just finding that backstory and then carrying the knowledge of both what he did and why, which is maybe something that you keep close to the vest, into these final 2 episodes?
I mean, that was something that Ronan Bennett, our writer, had spoken to me about that episode even before I'd read the script. So it was something that I had held from early on in the performance. But there is something, sociopathic about this guy, that what I find interesting about him is he's completely present in who he is with whomever he is in contact. But what I found intriguing about the series was the vulnerability and the moments of whether that is vulnerability or whether he's just a really fucking good actor and can use vulnerability to manipulate people. And you see him do it with Nuria when he persuades. One of the hardest moments for me in the series was, how do I persuade my wife? How do I tell her in a phone call that there is a room in our house behind my office filled with guns, prosthetics, and money and fake passports, and will you come and bring those to me in Budapest? And I found, and how do you navigate that and make that real without an audience checking out and going, oh, come on. And for me, that was about manipulation and emotional manipulation. And you've seen him earlier in episode 3 when he's in the funeral parlor, crying on cue, and I just said, okay, I'm just going to lean into his capacity to act, but I also like that blurry territory in which I don't think as an audience member, or he knows whether the emotion is real or whether it's presented.
He doesn't know?
I mean, I think he personally, I think he's deeply in love with his family, and he believes that these two things can coexist. I'm just trying to remember what happens in episode 9 and what happens in episode 10. So I'm trying desperately not to give you any spoilers.
I mean, I will say there's this a moment in this episode where she confronts him and she says, like, just say it. I kill people for money. And it's this very, and yes, watching the show, I think he really does. He really legitimately loves her.
Well, that scene was a scene that Ursula Corbero, who plays Nuria, who's extraordinary, she and I worked on because I wanted that to be the moment in which he's lived these two lives. And as absurd as it sounds, because I think we can all live in this weird, fucked up denial, he's never seen this moment. And it's her forcing him to look at himself. But I love what she says. She says, you're not listening. Say it again. Listen to what you're saying. Because he can perform it, but until it's actually engaging in here. And that moment when she goes, what did you think would happen? Or something. He goes, I never thought about it. Yeah. I genuinely believe that's true. You hear about these people who have whole other families that don't, that they're living in parallel, and you're like, how the fuck did you do that? But I think that there is a sort of, there are people who can live in those, in that blindness. God, it's so sort of bright on here. I can't see everybody out there. But anyway, I'm bollocking on. What are we talking about?
No. Well, I mean, in general, I was with your choices that you made. I mean, you mentioned Fantastic Beasts and Theory of Everything, The Danish Girl, and so many incredible films that you've done. And I feel like there is this through line where you do love a physical transformation. Is that something that even when you were starting out, when you were, doing plays in university or whatever, that you, was that something that drew you to it, that like, I need to kind of be in the skin of someone else?
Well, I think that when we start out as kids, if you're into acting, that's what it's all about, really. Is you're playing things very far from who you are. It's about putting on wigs and extraordinary costumes and playing old people and people, different. That playfulness is I think perhaps what's seductive. And I went to an old boys school, so I was playing girls in my teenage years. I was playing, before you go into the profession for real, you play everything and anything, and then you tend to get cast for what you look like and what you sound like, and so I definitely. I did love that side of things, but I never saw myself as like one of those actors that's the kind that do the and it was only when I was offered Theory of Everything that and when you do that, you sort of have to go, okay, well, how am I going to approach this? And I did it in that kind of teamwork way, in that I had a voice coach and a movement coach, and that was so enjoyable. Because there is a really technical element to it too, that I think that, and from that, people then go, oh, you're the guy that does this. And I'm like, I'm really not the guy that does that. I'm happy to try and be the guy that does that. I think, again, it makes it sound tactical, but or choice driven, but it's really just the way that it kind of unfolded. But over the years, when you work out ways to approach that, one of the things that did thrill me about this was that the Jackal is an actor, and the whole piece is kind of an actor's playground. And I thought I should be so lucky to get to roam in that skin.
Yeah. Which of your films have you seen the most?
Have I what?
Yeah, have you watched the
seen?
Most? Yes.
Oh God. I don't watch the films that I've been in once they're finished. I will always, like a bit like this, if a director invites me to be part of the process, like for example with Theory of Everything, because I'd spent a lot of time with families of people living with ALS. I knew the physical qualities of the disease perhaps better than the director did, so he wanted me in for a lot of that process. And some directors like Tom Hooper, who I've worked with a bit, has allowed me in. But the second that it's done, so while I can still do something to try and make it better, I'm all up for watching it over and over again. And as I said, I watched these episodes and rushes, and I knew the material like the back of my hand, really. But then never again. Because
you won an Oscar, right?
I just snorted. God, I just snorted. I think that all you see is the mistakes, honestly. But then when enough distance happens, and occasionally if you catch a glimpse of something on telly, what's lovely is that the work diminishes and the experience becomes the memory. And so whether it's, if I catch a moment of theory, remembering Felicity Jones and I, and how young and terrified we were, or Fantastic Beasts, it was just the sort of scale of the thing, and this extraordinary imagination that you could, on the scale of something so massive, that you could turn up and go, could I make my wand turn into an umbrella? And someone go, yeah, why not? I'm like, okay, and how about could I? So the really fun memories kind of stumble with them all.
What is when you look back at Cabaret, which you did both in London and here in New York, what is the memory of that stays with you?
In New York or in London, or sort of both?
Both.
God, it's all so new. I went out for dinner with Gail Rankin last night, who played Sally Bowles in Cabaret, and it was the first time we had ever gone for a meal together. Because despite the fact that she is a very close friend and someone that I adore, because it's so intense. Like the process of doing a show on Broadway and in the West End, doing a musical physically and vocally, you just never have let up. You can't go. Last night we went to a restaurant, had a drink, and could talk in a loud space, and we were reminiscing about it all. I mean, the moment that was perhaps most extraordinary for me was when it was Joel Grey and John Kander came to see it, and that was pretty profound because the piece itself had such a huge effect on me when I was younger. The feeling in London that was most extraordinary when we did it is we were all coming off the end of COVID, and we were one of the first shows to open, and Cabaret had in London, as it does here, that intimacy, and you could just see this roar of an audience and of the performers desperate to interact and to be able to feel and breathe together and sweat together, and so I think that was the thrill of the live experience was like this tidal wave that I think we all found pretty emotional.
Do you crave that? Do you have? I mean, you started doing theater. You have a Tony. You're gonna EGOT. You're gonna EGOT Eddie Redmayne at some point.
No way.
And you can sing. Come on.
I don't know about that.
You got that
vocal cords being put to rest for a while.
But do you have that thing of I'm craving being back on stage?
Not at the moment. 6 months on Broadway I loved every minute of it. But it's also, I know this sounds really, but I have young kids, and when you're doing a play, even though your days are free, and I was so, again, lucky to be doing it, but the way I work, and I think most actors work, is even though your days are free, it's like being an athlete. You wake up first thing in the morning. It's like, where are your vocal cords at? Do you have to go to see the ENT? Do you, you're starting warming, you're prepping for that 7 o'clock moment, and it sits in your head all day, and it means that I'm not particularly present as a human being. And I found, one of the the sort of complicated things I find about doing plays, and it was more extreme here in New York than it was in London, is you've also got to promote them and you've got to get out there. And it's one thing to be here talking about the Jackal now, 6, 7, 8, 10 months after you finish shooting it. But when you're doing the show at night and also trying to be out there and encouraging people to come and see it during the day, it's just all consuming. And that is amazing, but but I found I wasn't a particularly great dad or a great husband in that time, and so I'm very conscious. I'm very lucky to have opportunities, but at the moment, I loved every moment of Cabaret. It rinsed me, and I'll take a little breath. But the thrill of live performance, it's the reason I got into acting.
Absolutely. It's when you were saying that you felt like you weren't a good dad, it was making me think about how in this show, how so beautifully constructed that these two, Bianca and the Jackal, they're both messes and they're both very together, and just how thoughtful it was to not make her like the good person, and it's been interesting because, as I'm sure this audience feels, there are people who are they are Team Jackal all the way.
Well, that was, again, I think for both Lashana and I, that's what we, like, compared to the original book and the movie, in which it felt very black and white or sort of binary in the Jackal was bad and the detective figure, the Bianca figure played by Michael Lonsdale, was good, and even de Gaulle, who was the target, was seen as sort of the good figure. And what I loved about this adaptation when I read it which feels very of this moment, is that the morality was much more on a spectrum. We were in a place of greys and blurs, and that that they are two sides of the same coin in many ways, and that the audience's affections should oscillate between them, and you're then questioning yourself as you're rooting for someone who's doing horrific things. But even the UDC figure, I was like, wow, what he's talking for about kind of transparency seems to make a huge amount of sense. But wait, he's a complete fucking megalomaniac. There's no way, and I loved this idea that every character was because I find that with a lot of the public figures we look to now can be incredibly compelling in moments, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. No, wait a second, that doesn't mean, it's you're constantly being pulled and pushed and seduced. Yeah, and then it's interesting as an audience member, because you become almost complicit in it, because you find yourself, oh, am I totally okay with that, with this thing, or am I going to be judgmental or whatever it is about this thing that someone is doing. But also that I think one searches for like the what is the moral structure that he's working under, because he seems to have one, but it like you see in that episode 8 with the Afghanistan thing, there seems to be a very strong code, and yet actually he's consistently undermining it. So yeah, keeps you on your toes, hopefully.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When you were coming up with how to end this incredible season, and the show has been picked up for a second season, very happy to say. How scary was that, without spoiling anything, to think about how do we close this story that's been all over the world and that's just explored so many different things of all of these different characters and connections and betrayals? I mean, there was so much to weave together.
It was quite a thing. I mean, you'll have to wait and see as to what you think when you see the final episode. But it was really under the guidance of Anu, our director, and it was trying to stay true to the authenticity of elements of the Foresight book and the original movie, qualities there, whilst also subverting perhaps expectations, and being cathartic and satisfying whilst retaining that, the second you know everything about the Jackal, I think the enigma's gone, and the compulsion's gone. So it was an endless balance about what to show and what not to show.
Do you feel like you know everything about him?
I mean, do I know everything about him? No, I'm not sure I do, honestly. And that is something that is I found very different in from film to television, is that you're starting making the thing without knowing where you're ending, and I find that complex.
Were there? I mean, talking about season 2, were there things?
I'm not allowed to talk about it. I'm not even necessarily in season 2. I don't know. Shh.
Are there is there something, or I don't know, even when season 1, only in season 1, did you find yourself with a lingering question that you would finish shooting for the day and you would be like, oh, I still don't get that.
Endlessly. And constantly trying to mine it and dive into it. I mean, there were moments when we were shooting entrances and exits, not knowing quite what choice we wanted to make, and it was riveting making the last episodes, because in some ways they felt like those early kind of independent movies that I'd made, and it was throwing cameras on shoulders and seeing what we could catch. But there's a kind of visceral quality to it, I hope, is that bleeds into what you see on screen and is infectious in some ways.
Absolutely. I want to get to some audience questions. Nate asked, what do you think drives the Jackal? It looks like he has plenty of money, so why does he keep killing after he has a family and a good life? And like the sweetest house ever. I mean, New Yorkers love real estate. That house is...
I mean, I don't know whether to kill everyone's dreams and tell you that house is like an amalgam of houses and quite a lot of CGI, but it did have a beautiful infinity pool. But it was quite fun in the kind of the post-production going, in the vis effects going, let's give it a bit more greenery. Should we add a few more turrets here? Should we not? But I think kind of what I was talking about earlier, I think it's beyond that. I think people can, it's addiction. It's compulsion, it is talent, and as I was saying before, whilst I really do believe that he's trying to go, I'm going to stop this, I can't see him doing it, really. Yeah.
Do you find yourself thinking... Sarah asked this question about how do you feel about him today? And I'm curious about that question, but also, do you find yourself in your mind revisiting characters long after you've played them?
I have a really shoddy memory, so I can't even remember who I did yesterday, let alone, I mean, what... And I find it very humiliating that I've done quite a lot of plays in my time and quite a few Shakespeare plays, and I could probably not even quote you a line of any of those plays. But I do find physical qualities of characters remain with me afterwards. My wife often says that to me, that like something, like I find sort of some hand movements or kind of physical gestures can retain, and posture. Actually, for once in this, he had quite I was standing up straight, whereas in Fantastic Beasts, the character, he had these sort of open toes, and it was always this, and for you, I had to stretch up again and kind of find a... but I love that, because I feel that you end up being made up of the ashes of these characters. Yeah. What was the first part of that question?
If you feel differently about the Jackal now, months after playing him, and after, as a producer, you have also assembled this series, and yeah.
I mean, what I really wanted to do was somehow, like, the needle that I had to thread was, how do you make this person who is doing horrific things someone that you kind of, I don't know if you root for or fall for. And the thing that was most interesting to me were these moments of humanity. So there's this, when you're doing such abysmal things, when someone holds up goodness to you, it feels like quite a thing. And there was a line that was written in the script in which I'm driving off from Hungary and the young boy's in the front of the car, and he says, "You've got a good man face." And it really hit me in that moment. And it's when I think he sees the devil in him. And then when I was doing the scene with Andreas, who plays Rasmus, just as he, who's the guy who helps him who he has a sort of fling with, who helps in order to get him up into the roof. And he's saying goodbye to him, and I sort of improvised this line to him saying, "You've got a good man face." And because I think there is something real in those contacts. I think he is very present in that, and he has cut off so much of his humanity in his life in order to be good at what he does. And he was out there living a lone wolf existence after what happened in Afghanistan. And yet then, and that was what he had to do, and that's what he intended on doing. And then he met this woman living in Cadiz, and it's kind of riveting because our writer, Ronan Bennett, lives in Cadiz, is a chess obsessive, loves bird watching. So there's like quite a lot of the Jackal in Ronan, I think. But then when Nuria sees something in him, and that for a moment, his Achilles heel is believing that perhaps he can have both these things. Yeah. But finding those flashes of humanity and vulnerability were, I think, what drew me most to the character.
Yeah, in those moments, it's like you feel that he really does believe that there's a world where, like he says to his baby, like, we can just fly off somewhere, and in these flashes, like, we can have this happily ever after. And it's heartbreaking to watch that, because that will be a fleeting emotion. Yeah. Tori wanted to know how you prepare. I think it was so interesting what you said about listening to Chopin and being in your hotel room and kind of figuring out, assembling a weapon and just figuring out how to do that. Are you someone who, when you are preparing, you have music, and what's your process?
I basically love the prep side. If I would be you're asking about theatre, like when my most happy is rehearsing. Like, that's the bit that I adore. And with this, there was just so much fun to be had, whether it was the language side of things, or, we worked with this guy, Paul Biddis, who was an ex-soldier and sort of espionage. And it was so important to him that the Afghanistan element was correct. And I don't know if you remember that opening shot of the Afghanistan episode when it sort of pans over terrain, and then you realize that the two of them are camouflaged, the snipers aren't. And that particular thing that they're camouflaged under, Paul sat out making himself for weeks, because he used to do that when he was serving out in the Middle East. And all of those kind of elements, he gave Lashana and I some spy school. We learnt various odd, eccentric things, like apparently the best way to hide in plain sight is to put on a fluorescent yellow, like it's kind of builders, those gilet things, because no one looks at you, and even better is to have a clipboard. So a fluorescent gilet and a clipboard, and no one will look twice. So I haven't used that yet, but if I make it into season 2, you may well see a gilet and a clipboard. And then all of the the prosthetic side of things, working with Alex, my movement coach, we went to this Natalie Humphreys, our costume designer. She said, Eddie, would you come to Vienna for a costume fitting? And I was like, try and stop me. I'm coming now. And the reason she wanted me to come is there's this place called, I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's spelled Knize, Kniche, I think it was. And it's this amazing tailors in the center of Vienna that's from the 19th century. And it's the building is designed by a guy called Luce, an amazing architect in this kind of Art Nouveau style. And you go in there, and the tailor has the document of measurements from the Prince of Wales from the 1880s, and like all these kind of European aristocrats, and you watch their body shape change as they get older and fatter, and kind of like, and she basically took me there to have some of the costumes made there, but really she was like, this is the most Jackal place ever, and you kind of have to see it. And it was. And so I got to sort of to live out all of these dreams.
Yeah. The Jackal loves a look.
He loves a look. And this is kind of one of the things that I found so intriguing about him, is that there is this sort of peacocking element to him that differentiates him from some of the other guys in this genre. And you know, Brian Kirk, our director of the first three and one of the producers on it, really wanted that every time you saw him, he was wearing something different, whereas Bianca was more sort of stable in her clothes, but also that her clothes were super kind of chic but functional, that she was wearing trainers. Like, Lashana spent a lot of time talking to people who work in, or ex-people working in MI6, and you know, who talked about how wrongly it's depicted quite frequently.
Yeah. You mentioned that the two of you had a little mini spy school. You were like tracking each other, right?
We weren't actually. We were doing it independently, but we were taught to basically that you walk down streets and you use shop windows to see reflections. You use car windows, and Paul would then send us, after he had taught us all this stuff, he would send us these photos of people that we had to track, and this was in Covent Garden, right in the centre of London. And we would track these people, and then he would send us a photo of someone else that was trying to track you, and your phone becomes a really useful thing because he basically made us take as much footage as we could surreptitiously. And then the other thing is sort of pretending to be on the phone. It's quite random moments and it was all going very well in Covent Garden until I walked past this kind of one of those like statues of people just standing there and where the person I was following was, and then some tourists asked for a selfie. And so I thought I was completely, you know, flying under the radar, and it transpires I was 100% visible. Shit spy.
Do you research a TV role any differently from a movie role?
No, actually, I really didn't. I mean, other than what I was saying about not having the scripts, so not knowing what the full arc was, but, you know, we had bits of that on other films that I've done. I found it exactly the same. The thing that was harder was different, was that it was, you know, a 9-month period and you're jumping between different directors. That was the first time I've ever done that. I'm used to sort of working for one director, and here there were 4 directors. And so in some ways, in this country, you have the showrunner, the person who's the kind of creative head, and we don't have that in the UK. So in some ways, Lashana and I became kind of the glue between the episodes.
I mean, someone wants to know your workout regimen. I will say you are ripped in this.
Well, my workout regimen, there's a really brilliant man, or a horrendous man, depends on which way I look at it, called David Higgins, who is a fantastic trainer who, again, years ago, there was a moment in Fantastic Beasts in which my character was meant to take off his clothes, and despite being quite sort of skinny and nerdy, was then meant to be ripped. And so I sort of spent months working with David Higgins, and then the scene was cut. Despite, and I think it was cut because I basically spent the whole scene like this, trying to look like I had a six-pack. But I've worked with him on and off over the years, and he was brilliant. He made me eat a load of chicken do a load of sit-ups, and but it did make me laugh because there's a scene in episode 4 in which I'm doing a plank, and it's like I have to be topless in the mirror, and he's meant to look all kind of ripped, and Anthony, our director, was like, Eddie, so for that one, mate, I've got this shot, and it's going to come in through the window from Paris. It's all a one shot. And directors love to talk about one shots, the kind of virtuoso one shot thing. Actors fucking hate it because it means there's nothing to cut to. So if the shot doesn't work, it's like gone. And I was like, okay, cool. So I did all my sit-ups and did all the thing. But this shot went on for like 10 minutes. It was 10 minutes along my body, kind of up my thing, in the thing. And in my head, I was like, it's never gonna happen. But I like not eaten for days, only chicken, nothing but sit-ups, like pumping all the stuff. And anyway, and you arrive on set, and like the thing that actors don't talk about when you're doing like topless scenes is you arrive and you're like, what's the lighting like? like, is this gonna help me, or is this gonna do? Anyway, all of it was great. It was fine. We survived. It looked all right. That night, he's like, Ed, yes. So, and by the way, I'd just gone and shoveled like 3 bowls of spaghetti bolognese into my mouth straight after the event. He's like, yeah. So the shot's a bit too long. So we're going to have to redo that shot in like 3 weeks. I was like, no fucking way, mate. That's all you've got. Like,
make it work.
Make it work.
Put that producer hat on.
He's like, cut around it.
Yeah. Well, we get into it in a minute, but before we end, I did want to ask you, theoretically, should the Jackal survive this season, in a second season, first of all, where are you going? Because it's like travel porn for all of us.
Yeah.
And second of all, when are you headed back to work? And how does it feel to get to re-inhabit this character?
Do you know... I'm really not allowed to say anything. It's just like, oh, God. Where would you like... Okay, here's a good question. Because I will remain a producer on it, even if I'm not in it. Where would you like to see the Jackal go? Any suggestions? Brooklyn. Love that. Yeah. Did you say Maldives? Yes. I love both of those choices. Okay, this is great. The Maldives may have been somewhere I've already suggested. Brooklyn, I'm very much up for. Anywhere else?
You could...
DC.
Get out of
it's
the
inevitable
America,
we'll be
people.
in DC.
He's like a worldwide traveler.
Guys, this is good. Okay, from where? Singapore. Boston. Boston's got too tricky an accent. the Jackal wouldn't be able to pull off the Boston accent. Like something more general American I can handle. Yes, there we go. Okay, this is brilliant, guys. There we go. We've got several seasons. This is fantastic.
Maybe there's a crossover with White Lotus, which will be in Thailand.
Yes.
And Jackal, because
Maldives, Thailand, China, mix in a bit of Succession. We could be in like Brooklyn and sort of, yeah.
Yes, Scandinavia, yep. Mm-hmm.
Scandinavia, this is, guys, we're just, exactly, just like no words, just travel shots. Which, to be fair, are some of my favorite moments in the show. It's like, ooh, that's a really hot shot of Budapest. Yeah.
The show is visually beautiful. It's so good. It's so much fun to watch. I'm so happy for you that you just got your Critics' Choice nomination, as did the show, and a Golden Globe nomination for you, as did the show. Part 2 of the season finale will air on Thursday night, of course, on Peacock. And just congratulations, an extraordinary performance.
And thank you so much. And thank you guys for coming out on a rainy New York December evening. Thank you.
Eddie Redmayne, thank you for joining me. And thank you all so much. And thank you to 92.